Hey there, everybody. Oh, sorry, I totally put my finger over the camera. This is the rookie over here, Danielle, asking questions today of our pest expert, Mike Peaslee, and today we want to talk about bats. I mean, it seems pretty fitting. We've got Halloween right around the corner, but besides that, it is kind of a bat season, I guess, to some sense.
Yeah, well, I think it's when people are thinking about bats, but probably more because of Halloween than necessarily bats being all that active right now.
So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions today, Mike, but for everybody that are watching live, feel free to tune in with your own questions about bats. And if you have other pests that you want to hear about in the future, we're going to continue doing these videos every other Monday at noon. So go ahead, chime in, let us know what you want to learn about. We're here to answer all your questions. And next week we'll be talking about those filthy rats.
Next week?
Yeah. Well, next week, in 2 weeks. Thank you, Mike. Good call. In 2 weeks. Next
filthy
time
rats. Okay.
So,
now, are all rats filthy?
I don't know.
We'll have to wait for 2 weeks to find out.
That's right. So let's just start with some basic bat questions, like what kinds of bats can we find here in New England? I'm assuming no vampire bats.
No, there are no vampire bats. Vampire bats, there's actually 3 specific species of vampire bats, and they're native to Central and South America. So pretty sure that we're safe from vampire bats around this part of the country. So the primary bats that we have in New England are little brown bats and large brown bats. The most common being the little browns.
And so I'm wondering, do they have hair or fur, feathers? I'm assuming not feathers, but maybe.
Yeah, bats basically have like a fine fur. It's very similar to a mouse, and in fact, a bat actually interesting if you hold a bat up by the wings. That almost looks like you can see the bone structure. It almost looks like an expanded foot that's covered with just a fine layer of skin and fur.
Well, interesting. And so often you hear people think, or at least maybe it's my perception, that bats carry rabies, like in the movie Cujo.
It is true that bats do carry rabies, but usually a small percentage of the bats in a colony may be rabid. You may have colonies that have no rabies in them whatsoever.
Are there
it's
any?
Not a common concern, but if you encounter a live bat, you certainly don't want to be handling them with your bare hands or anything like that. There is definitely a risk of having rabies, so you don't want to expose yourself unnecessarily.
Right. So would there be any other kind of diseases that we should be concerned about with bats?
The problem with bats isn't really so much diseases that the bats themselves carry, but with guano that can build up in harborages, in roosting sites. You can have other diseases that are associated with that, potentially histoplasmosis being one of those that is actually caused by a fungal spore that's in their droppings that can cause illness.
Okay, well that's good to know. So about how big are the bats that we do find in New England?
Depending again on the species, the wingspan on a small brown bat is up to about 9 inches. A large brown is up to about 7. Up to about 11. They're actually very small. A small brown bat weighs about 1/4 of an ounce, and a large brown is about double that at 1/2 an ounce. So they're actually a pretty small animal.
Right. Well, Don Hart has a question for us. Hi, Don.
Don always has a question for us.
Yeah. He wants to know, what good are they? Do they do anything beneficial to us?
Bats absolutely are very beneficial. The bats, particularly in New England and most all of the United States, they're insectivores. They eat lots of insects. Nice. So they're feeding on mosquitoes and moths and different types of flying insects, beetles, and various things. So in that aspect, yeah, they're very beneficial.
So you always hear this, that bats fly at your heads and get tangled in your hair. Is that true?
Yeah, that's kind of one of those, I don't know, can I say old wives' tales? Is that politically incorrect?
No.
That's really kind of a myth. Does it happen occasionally? Yeah, anything's possible. But as a norm, no, that's not something that's going to happen. Bats are not blind like most people think. They do have some degree of vision. They also use echolocation, which is like a sonar type of sound, to help spatially locate where they are in relation to their surroundings. So the likelihood of one getting caught in your hair is not all that great.
So are there other things then that bats will eat besides insects? Or
The species that we have here strictly feed on insects.
so, okay, this is a really burning question that I have is, are they active during the winter, or do they hibernate? Do they fly south? What do they do?
They are not active during the winter. They do basically hibernate, depending again on the species. Large brown bats, much smaller colonies, usually small, not relatively small numbers, maybe between 20 to 50, possibly up to 100 or two, but most of the time they're relatively small colonies. Those will usually overwinter either in a cave fairly close by, cracks in trees, voids in things like that. They sometimes will occasionally overwinter in the harborage that they're using during the summer, inside of a building, in an unheated attic, things of that nature. Small brown bats have two definitely distinct colonies where they have one roost site that they use during the summer that they will leave, and typically they'll overwinter as a colony in caves is the most common place for them. And that could be for that species, it could be several hundred miles from where their summer roost is.
Yeah, huh. So how long do bats live? What is their lifespan like on average?
A bat's lifespan, and obviously there's lots of variables because there's lots of things when you only weigh a quarter or half an ounce, even though you fly. There's still lots of risks that they're exposed to. But as a rule, they can live like between 4 to 10 years.
Oh wow!
And there have been some bats that have been documented that are 20 years or more old. So,
wow.
So they have a relatively long lifespan compared to most of the things that we talk about. That's days or weeks or a few months. So.
Right. Huh. Well, that's pretty interesting. So, I guess really back to why should I be concerned if I have bats living in my attic?
There's multiple reasons why you should be concerned if you have bats living in your attic. Number one, obviously, you don't want to be exposing yourself, even though the risk is small, you don't want to expose yourself, your family, to that potential risk of having a rabid animal in your house.
Right.
But they also can carry other insects that are vectors on the bats, that feed on the bats, things like fleas and ticks and mites. And bat bugs is a fairly common one, which actually is very similar to a bed bug. That actually can be a pest that will feed on people.
Ooh, so that doesn't sound very good.
No, none of those things are things that you want in your house, as well as it can be disruptive having bats flying around outside your house in the evening in the summertime. You're sitting out in the backyard with the fire pit going or something, and the bats are flying around. Although I personally enjoy watching them, but
right, it just depends. I suppose.
And the noise that they make, the odor. If you have a large colony that's been there, established, they will use the same roost year after year. So you can get issues with odors and noise and those types of things, as well as potential of diseases.
Yeah. So we have Dawn back with us. Dawn would like to know, do they only come out at night? That's a great question.
Yes, as a rule, bats are definitely nocturnal. The only time you're going to normally find a bat active is at night. They usually will leave their roost to go out to feed within an hour of dusk, and will go back before dawn.
So we really wouldn't see them during the day.
If you see one during the day, it's probably sick. You definitely want to avoid it. Don't be handling it, because it's not the normal behavior for them.
Right. So it's uncharacteristic.
Yes, definitely.
So yeah, back to the noises that they make. What kind of what does it sound like? Does it sound like a bird or?
No, it's like squeaking and the kind of like that sonar sound that they're kind of giving off, that they use for that echolocation, and scratching noises, them crawling around inside of the wall or the attic as they're going in and out of the building.
All right, cool. And here's another good question that we have. So, are they a protected species? I think
most bats are protected, yes, and you definitely should not be killing the bats. They are beneficial, and there are many species that are endangered. So you definitely should not be doing anything to physically harm them.
So if I have bats in my attic, I know I don't want them there because I'm all set with the poo all over the place. And how are we getting rid of them then if you're not killing them?
The only safe, effective way to do that is by doing exclusions to prevent them, to allow them to go out, but to prevent them from getting back in. So there's a lot of sealing that has to be done around cracks and crevices, around openings in buildings. A bat can go through a hole 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch, so it doesn't take much of an opening.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of exclusion work that has to be done, and use of one-way doors that allows the bats to come out to feed at night, but prevents them from going back in. But it's also very critical that be done at the proper time of year, so that you're not sealing up, preventing them from getting back in when you have young inside that harborage.
Oh, that's interesting to know, because I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, there's from June till about mid-September, you cannot do bat exclusion work.
Right.
Because of having young in the colony.
Right. Is that something you can investigate and see if there is young and determine whether, or is it just safer
at that time of year? If you have a colony, that's roosting inside your house, you are going to have young there.
I've got a couple more questions. First, we've got Paydenhart, who wants to know, how often do they bite people or animals, especially dogs?
It's very rare. It is very rare. They're not, again, they're feeding on insects. They feed while they're in flight. So
if you have a flying insect like dog, then maybe.
So the likelihood of them biting a person, of them biting a pet, is very, very small.
Okay. And so David Pride, hey David, do bats lay eggs like a bird?
No, they do not. Bats are mammals that have live birth.
Yeah.
They're actually the only true flying mammal.
Ah, that's pretty interesting. And so I guess, when it comes to bat exclusion, is that really something I could do myself? I mean, probably not me, but let's say the husband.
It's pretty difficult because, again, there's so many small holes that they may get into. It can be pretty challenging to find all of those and to be able to seal those up, as well as, again, you don't want to seal it up while the bats are in there without providing them a way to get out, because if you do, the potential risk with that is that if you seal all the holes around the outside of your building so that they can't get out while the bats are in there, they've got to come out to feed. They're going to try to find a way to get out.
Oh.
Unlike a rodent that could chew a hole and get back out, a bat can't do that. So what happens is people try to do this exclusion themselves. Sometimes that's how bats end up being trapped inside of a house where people are in the living space,
like in their bedroom.
So you have you have the bat come out inside of the house in the living space, flying around,
trying to get
because it's not able to find its way to get outside because it's been excluded from the outside.
Okay.
So now you're increasing that risk of exposure to the bats and having them flying around. So
yeah. So we have Joe Kellemer on with us. Hey, Joe. And he'd like to know, can a bat live its whole life in a human's home?
Can it live its whole life in a human's home? I would say, well, obviously it's got to come out to feed.
Right.
But as far as living in that structure, potentially they could, yes, because some species are bad. Again, large brown bats will sometimes use the same harborage during the winter, the same roost site during the winter. And the ones that do leave very commonly will go back to that same site year after year after year.
Right.
So they will live a great deal of their life in that same roost.
Yeah. Well, good question, Joe. And so when we perform an exclusion and a remediation service, can you tell us what that will mean then? I know you kind of went into it a little bit, but
yeah, we'll seal up all the openings that we can find where the bats can go in and out, leaving a few primary openings that have one-way doors on them that allow the bats to go out but prevent them from getting back in, and leave those up usually for several weeks, maybe several months, depending on the size of the colony and different variables, to make sure all the bats are out before we go back, take off those one-way doors, and finish doing the exclusion on those areas. We also do, you mentioned remediation. Depending on how large the colony is, how long they've been there, if you've got a lot of droppings in there, or what people refer to as guano, with bats, you can have other parasites of the bats. You can have insects in there that can be pest issues. So we do offer remediation as well as treatment of those sites to take care of those types of secondary pests.
and so is that basically the method for getting rid of bats, or are there any other preventative type things to do, or?
The tighter your house is,
Yeah.
just like with most pests, the tighter your house is, the better. So, just maintaining your property as well as you can. But a lot of times they're getting in as, places that you don't really see. It's up around the eaves. It's the soffit vents. It's the gable end, the vents on the gable ends of the house where the screening isn't really tight. If you're the homeowner that really pays a lot of attention to that stuff, that's the handyman, and can keep those things sealed up some before you get a problem, that's the best way to do that.
So how big of a hole are we talking about that they can squeeze into?
3/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch.
Yeah.
So we're talking, pretty small hole. It can be pretty challenging on even an average house to find all of those potential areas.
Right. Let's see, what else do I have for questions here? I think that's about it for me. Is there anybody else out there watching that would like to ask Mike any other questions about bats or any other pests? I'm looking quiet. Well, we're going to wrap things up then. If you have any other burning bat questions, go ahead. You can still ask them. We'll continue to answer the questions after this is no longer live. And if you have any other questions, feel free to either go to our website, which is modernpest.com, or just leave them here with us, and we'll be signing off. Anything else from you, Mike?
Watch out for the bats on Halloween.
All right. Oh, wait, we've got one question. Sorry. It looks like Peyton Hart has one more question, then we'll wrap up. When they are not living in my barn or attic, where do they usually live?
Typically, they will live, again, depends on the species, but a lot of bat species will live in caves. So they'll leave their summer roost site, that maternity colony where they're having their young, and we'll leave that and we'll spend winters in caves. And there are a lot of bats that just live in caves in general anyway.
Yeah. All right, for real this time. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be tuning out now, but in 2 weeks, we'll be talking again about rats. So we'll talk to y'all then. Thanks. Bye.